Have you ever tried to read a line from Beowulf and just stared at it, feeling like you're looking at a completely different language? I mean, it's supposed to be English, right? But then you can pick up Shakespeare from hundreds of years later, and okay, it takes a little work, but you can get it. So what happened? How did our language change so much, so fast? Well, that is the exact mystery we are going to unpack today.
And hey, it is not just you wondering about this. This question comes straight from a Reddit user. And it just perfectly nails the feeling, doesn't it? To our modern ears, calling it gibberish feels pretty accurate. So this isn't some dusty academic question, it's something a lot of us have scratched our heads about.
Okay, look at this. You can literally see the difference on the screen, but you can also hear it. In Old English, you'd have said something like, on eldra mana segenum. The words look alien, some of the letters don't even look like ours anymore, and yet that translates directly to in old men's sayings. So how on earth did we go from that to this?
To figure this out, we need to hop into a linguistic time machine. We're going to journey back through more than 1,000 years of history to find the exact moments, the key events that totally reshaped the English language into what we speak today.
Our first stop, this is one of the biggest turning points in the entire history of English. We're talking about an invasion that wasn't just about armies and castles, it was a vocabulary invasion. This single event kicked off a massive word swap that forever changed the sound, the feel, the very DNA of English. So let's get our bearings. Way back in the 900s, we've got Beowulf. That's pure, hardcore Old English. Then, bam, 1066, the Norman invasion. You see that date? That's the Great Dividing Line. Everything changes after that. You get Chaucer's Middle English, which, yeah, it's tough, but you can see the resemblance. And then you get to Shakespeare's Early Modern English, which feels almost like something we could speak. That 1066 date, that's ground zero.
And this, right here, illustrates the effect of that invasion perfectly. So, picture this. The Anglo-Saxon peasants, the folks who spoke Old English, they were the ones working on the farm. So we kept their words for the live animals, chicken, cow, pig. But the new bosses, the Norman French rulers, they were the ones sitting at the fancy dinner table. So for the cooked meat, we ended up using their words, poultry, beef, pork. It's like we ended up with two parallel vocabularies living side by side in the same language.
And this wasn't just some brief takeover. We're talking about 300 years. For 3 centuries, French was the official language of power, of the courts, of the government in England. That is a long time, more than a dozen generations. Just try to imagine the sheer volume of French and Latin words that came flooding into the English language. It wasn't just a few new words, it was a total transformation from the ground up.
But just swapping out a bunch of words is only one piece of the puzzle. There was something deeper going on. The very structure of the language, the fundamental rules, its operating system, was also being quietly rewritten in the background.
Right, so while everyone was busy learning all these fancy new French words, the grammatical engine of English was getting a massive overhaul. This is what I'd call the invisible transformation, the change that truly separates Old English from everything that came after it.
Okay, here's a great example. Old English really liked a sentence structure we now call the inner passive, something like, sight of some things was lost. It feels a little clunky to us, right? A bit formal or backward. Well, over time, English started to prefer what we call the outer passive, some things were lost sight of. See how the object of the sentence, some things, jumps right to the front? That's a fundamental change in how we actually build our thoughts into sentences.
And this wasn't some minor gradual tweak. Just look at this chart. You can see this huge spike in the use of that outer passive starting around the 18th century. You can literally see the language actively changing its own rules. English speakers were, as a group, starting to structure their thoughts and their sentences in a fundamentally different way. It's fascinating.
And here's another really cool process called lexicalization. Now that's a big fancy word, but in simple terms, it's basically when a word gets a promotion and a brand new job. For example, an adverb, which usually describes a verb, starts moonlighting as an adjective, which describes a noun. It's a subtle shift, but it's incredibly powerful.
Check out this quote from 1777, all his hitherto offenses. Now, hitherto is an adverb that just means until now, but look at what it's doing here. It's acting like an adjective, directly describing the offenses. We would never say his until now offenses today, it sounds so strange, but it just goes to show how flexible and experimental English grammar was becoming.
Or how about this one from even earlier, in 1655, the now wearer. Again, now is an adverb, but here it's jumping in to do an adjective's job, describing the wearer.
It's another perfect example of a word just hopping over the grammatical fence to a new category. This is a language in flux, finding new, more efficient ways to get a point across.
Okay, so we've got a flood of new words and a complete rewrite of the grammar book. That explains a lot, for sure. But it doesn't quite explain why Old and Middle English sound so completely and utterly alien to us. There is one more giant piece to this puzzle. And trust me, it is a big one. It's officially called the Great Vowel Shift, but I prefer to call it the Great Vowel Heist. Why? Because it basically stole all their predictable phonetic vowel sounds and left us with the gloriously messy, confusing spelling system we have to deal with today. This is the main reason pronunciation changed so drastically.
Here's a perfect example. For hundreds of years, the word we spell M-I-C-E was pronounced meese. Simple, right? But then, during this great vowel shift, the sounds of all the long vowels in English began to, well, shift. They started moving up in the mouth. So that long E sound slowly migrated and became the I sound we know today. Meese became mice. This happened to countless words, completely changing the soundscape of English, all while the spelling mostly stayed frozen in time.
And here's the thing. This process never actually stopped. The English language isn't some finished product sitting in a museum. It's more like software that's constantly in beta mode. The same forces that turned hitherto into an adjective are still chugging away, creating new words and new rules as we speak.
Take the idea of a productive affix. Again, sounds technical, but it's just a word part, like a suffix, that we're actively using to invent new words. A perfect modern example is tacking y's onto the end of a noun to mean in terms of or speaking of.
And this isn't some ancient history we're talking about. This quote is from a newspaper in 1993, job-wise. That's a pretty recent invention, linguistically speaking. We took the noun job, slapped y's on the end, and boom, we created a whole new adverb. This is language evolution happening in our own lifetime. So let's just sum it all up. When you ask why we can understand Shakespeare but not Beowulf, it really comes down to three massive forces. First, you have the vocabulary invasion from the Normans, which flooded English with new words. Second, the grammar itself got rewritten, changing how we build sentences. And third, the pronunciation revolution, that great vowel shift, completely altered how the language was spoken out loud. Which of course leaves us with one last, really fascinating question to think about. 1,000 years of change has made the English of 1025 totally unintelligible to us today, so what about the next 1,000 years? Given how language is still evolving, do you think the English speakers of the year 3025 will be able to understand us? What do you think our language is going to sound like then?